Thank you, Jim. And probably the most useful parts of my background for today is that I've spent about more than 20 years in the land grant system in the United States, dating back to 1975, and more than a dozen years dating really from experience from 1993 in Australia. And I'll draw heavily on that now, looking at the future of agricultural extension in Australian universities. And I'm just using extension as shorthand. I'm very much aware that there's a traditional view that extension was of expert authorities passing along facts, knowledge, and wisdom in an authoritarian way. But much more recently, the way we try to approach extension is knowledge partnerships based on joint inquiry. But for the sake of today, I'm just going to use extension as a shorthand for what's obviously a much more complicated thing. And the overview of what I'll talk about is the relatively low contributions by Australian universities currently and why that is to extension, some plausible lessons from the U.S. land grant system, and some plausible actions. And I should say there's a thread that runs through this series in addition to the ACDA, and that's WAGA, that it was really a conversation I had one morning over breakfast with John Caron at Charles Sturt University that really caused me to think about this in more detail and has kept me thinking about it ever since. So I refer back to one of the slides that Roger Lee showed earlier about what the expenditure is in terms of research. And what you get out of this is universities in Australia are contributing on the order of about a fifth of the agricultural research based on the expenditure. And so you might expect they'd have a role on the order of about a fifth in extension as well, but it's probably far less than that. The other thing that's important to keep in mind, also drawing on what Roger said earlier, is that there are long lags between research discovery and take-up, illustrated here, of course, by no-till farming in southern Australia. But there are many other examples. This one I've taken from Julian Alston, who spoke earlier today about these same sorts of things. In the case of hybrid corn, and even genetically modified corn in the United States, it was still 19 years back in the 30s and 40s, and even 13 years more recently before these technologies were widely adopted. That's despite the fact there were enormous and obvious yield advantages right from the start. It still took a long time for these things to percolate through the system. So what does it take to actually get adoption? And I'm really looking for some help from people in the audience who might know of a great quantitative reference to this. But it seems to me that typically there are champions in the research or farm organizations who develop over the years a very close working relationship with the farming community and continue to promote really good ideas. So one person who comes readily to mind is my friend Bill Crabtree in Western Australia, who became called No-Till Bill because he kept hammering on this sort of thing year after year. And it takes people like that. In the University of California system where I work, there were people who year after year hammered away on managing pests and weeds without excessive use of pesticides and kept pushing these ideas in front of growers and gradually bringing them around. So what's the risk of not having a good extension? Is the lost opportunity costs of delays in the adoption of new technologies or the failure to adopt them at all? So that's really what's at loss. And Roger referred to this earlier as well from studies in the United States and Australia, that the estimates of investment in extension, the returns on the order of 20 to 60%. So this is a substantial contribution in terms of overall returns to agriculture. So what is it that limits the universities in Australia from participating in this? And what you have to realize is the funding model in universities in Australia, in contrast to the United States, is all about teaching. And this was a wake-up call to me when I moved to the University of Adelaide in 1995, where I'd left Cornell University, where there had been a plant science department of roughly 8 staff and 2 superstars, and moved to one in Adelaide of roughly the same composition. And the fact that the department at Cornell couldn't have cared less if it had undergraduates, whereas the one in Adelaide was starving for resources. Because in the US, they get large and immediate, well-funded indirect cost rates for the research. Australian system it's not fully funded, and there are great delays in the funding. Just complete difference in terms of how they worked. And so the bottom line is that universities lose money on research. The Cutler Review noted this in 2008 and recommended that the government should adopt the principle of fully funding the cost of university research activities. The current government has endorsed this but hasn't actually done it yet. And just as an example, we estimate at the University of Melbourne that we invest about $700 million a year in research, which is on the order of the total investment in CSIRO, but receive only about $400 million in actually doing that. The other $300 million is basically subsidized from our teaching, not the other way around. So there is no capacity in universities to do this, in stark contrast to the US system. So what does that mean? That the staff and administrative focus that I can reinforce as a dean has to be on teaching. Most of the promotion we have is based on research and teaching, although recently the University of Melbourne has started to adopt knowledge transfer as one of those criteria. And the bottom line for a lot of research projects is that once the grant runs out, and typically these grants have been getting shorter and shorter, but you might assume it's a 3-year grant, not only is there little incentive for the person to continue to keep going out and doing extension, there's actually strong disincentives because there's no funding, even for the cost of travel and so forth, to get out and do the work. So when you see people in universities in Australia, they're actively out going to doing research, I can almost guarantee you that in nearly every case, it's time taken away from their families or their other activities. It extends their work week from 50 hours a week to 60 or 70. They get no extra help in doing this. And again, it's a sharp contrast to the United States system. So we're going to come back to this figure about roughly a fifth of the research funding in Australia is to universities in research. Roughly, in the most recent figures, roughly a third to the states, about 20% to the Commonwealth. And I've been looking around. This is another place where I'll look for some quantitative help. I've been looking around for measures of what's happening with extension. And one that came to mind was a look at the Grains Research and Development Corporation Seed of Light Awards, which are very coveted. And what they're given to people who have made a significant contribution to communicating the outcomes of research. So I looked on the website when it finally occurred to me to use this measure just a couple of days ago. What has been the allocation of Seed of Light Awards since its inception over the 13-year period, where they give one in each of the GRDC's regions, western, southern, and eastern regions? 19 of the awards, 53%, went to state government, really throwing above their weight given that they get about 30% of the funding. Other organizations, such as Ian McClellan at Birchip, account for about 10%. This is roughly coincident with a 20-odd% funding that goes to industry, funding from industry for research. CSRO, 14% of the awards, a little less than their 20%. If you look at universities, it's just 6% of all the Seed of Light Awards have been awarded to university researchers. Is this fundamentally because university researchers don't care about research? They're not interested, they don't do it? I suggest they're bad at nominating people. There are all those issues, but I think fundamentally it says something about how the system works against university participation. And I'll point to the two examples of university researchers. They're both good friends of mine, as it happens. Chris Preston at the University of Adelaide, who just basically does it off the back of his other time. The other is Steve Powell's, who probably deserved one much sooner than he got it just a year or two ago. But part of what's coincident with Steve Powell's receiving a Seed of Light Award is he moved to establish the Western Australian Herbicide Resistance Initiative, which has been a 5-year block grant from the GRDC for research in this area and extended beyond, which I think helps illustrate the point that what propelled Steve and put Steve in a really good position to be able to make major contributions to extension was that his funding was not dependent on teaching and research to be able to do it. If you take away Steve's example, we've got just lonely Chris Preston, 3%, only just one out of all the Seed of Light Awards awarded to a university researcher toiling away, trying to squeeze in extension on the side.